Good evening, everybody. My name's Stuart Humphreys. I am the director of the Lincoln Institute for Advanced Studies. Apologies, I'm having a little problem with my camera at the moment, but I will keep talking and you won't need to see me anyway. So I'm delighted to welcome you to Professor Louise Wilkinson's inaugural lecture this evening. This is the latest in our series of lecture series where we celebrate our incoming new professors and ask them to tell us about the leadership that they show in their research and teaching, and to give us an insight into the kind of research that they do and how they've got to where they are in their careers. So it's really about understanding how Louise got to Lincoln and what she's been doing to get there. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce her. But before that, there is one or two quick things I need to go over in terms of housekeeping. Other than that, there is not much to say initially, other than if you are interested in attending any more of these virtual lectures, or indeed real life lectures when we get back to normality, then do keep in touch with us through the Lincoln Institute for Advanced Studies email, join our mailing list, or follow us on Facebook. So without further ado, I will introduce to you the Pro-Vice Chancellor for the College of Arts, that's Professor Abigail Woods, who is going to give the introduction to Louise's lecture and give her the welcome that she deserves. So I'll hand over to Abigail.
Thank you, Stuart, and welcome everyone. It's so nice to see so many people here, and for all the difficulties that the COVID pandemic has meant, the opportunity to meet virtually and for so many people to come together, an event like this, which might be difficult to attend in person, is really, really great to see. So thank you all. And I'm really delighted to introduce Louise Wilkinson's inaugural lecture. Louise is our Professor of Medieval Studies, and she joined Lincoln in the middle of the pandemic last June. But despite all of those difficulties, she has really embedded herself very quickly into the life of the School of History and Heritage, which is her institutional home, into the College of Arts, and among the various local people and organisations who are very invested and interested in the region's medieval history. Louise studied for her MA and PhD degrees at King's College London. And after a period as a research fellow, she spent 16 years at Canterbury Christ Church University, where she progressed from lecturer to senior lecturer to reader, and then in 2014 to professor. Along the way, she was a co-investigator on two major cross-institutional AHRC-funded research projects on the roles of King Henry III and the Magna Carta. She participated in public celebrations marking the 800th anniversaries of Magna Carta and the Battle of Lincoln. And she authored 3 books, edited another 4, and produced a number of chapters and articles. It's particularly appropriate for Louise to have joined us here in Lincoln because she has conducted so much research on the history of medieval Lincolnshire. Her doctorate, which gave rise to her first book, published in 2007, examined the lives of various women in 13th century Lincolnshire, including Lady Nicola de la Haye, Lincoln's castellan and sheriff, after whom one of our university buildings is named. Her second book was a full-scale biography of Eleanor de Montfort, one of the most important women in the 13th century English realm. And her next volume will address women, lordship and power, the English aristocracy from 1199 to 1327. So like you, I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about Louise's passion for medieval women in this inaugural lecture on searching for Amazons uncovering women's lives in medieval Lincolnshire and beyond. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Abigail, for a lovely welcome. And it's so nice to see the names of so many friends and colleagues, past and present, popping up in the list of attendees here tonight. So thank you all so very much for coming along. I'm now going to share my screen with you and my slides, and we shall begin. So, during the last 25 years, my two great academic passions have been uncovering the lives of medieval women and investigating 13th century records. As an undergraduate and postgraduate student at King's College London, I was fortunate to study under two wonderful and incredibly kind scholars. Professor David Carpenter, the leading authority on King Henry III, and Professor Dame Ginty Nelson, an expert on the Carolingians and also on medieval women. It was at King's that I became fascinated by the way in which English medieval history was dominated by narratives of kings and their relationship with male barons and advisors. Royal or aristocratic women tended to feature in contemporary chronicles on the margins of political events, or so it seemed. They seldom appeared as political actors and agents in their own rights. They seldom appeared as people who shaped local and national affairs. Yet the incredibly rich documentary evidence for England in the reigns of King John, King Henry III, and Edward I told a rather different story. So here, royal and aristocratic women featured in a whole range of different contexts, governing their households and estates with varying degrees of success, it has to be said, influencing affairs, litigating over property in the royal courts, petitioning the king, and sometimes holding office. And I was very much intrigued by evidence that aristocratic ladies participated in the 13th century civil wars, saw themselves as members of England's political community, and actively defended their families' interests. So since the 1990s, my own research and publications have really promoted a more inclusive approach to the history of 13th century England that recognises the contribution made by women to politics and culture. So why has the 13th century absorbed so much of my interest? Well, it was the best of centuries, wasn't it? It was a pivotal period in English history that witnessed the emergence of Magna Carta, the great Charter of Liberties issued by King John and then reissued in the reign of his son, King Henry III. And it also saw the process by which the principles and measures embodied within it became embedded in English society. The 13th century also saw two major civil wars, the First and Second Barons' Wars of 1215 to 1217 and 1264 to 1267, and it also saw the emergence of the parliamentary state. Royal and aristocratic women benefited from clauses that touched upon their property rights in Magna Carta, and they took part in the events that shaped England's political landscape in this period. Now, after completing my doctoral thesis in 1999, I cut my teeth as a postdoctoral researcher at the National Archives, working for Professor Richard Hoyle on an AHRB-funded project to calendar or summarise in England the Latin patent rolls of Queen Elizabeth I. In September 2004, I then moved to the beautiful cathedral city of Canterbury to become a lecturer at Canterbury Christ Church University. And I gradually worked my way up through the ranks, as Abigail said, and became a professor of medieval history there in 2014. In the summer of 2020, I then moved to another beautiful cathedral city, Lincoln, following my appointment as Professor of Medieval Studies here, and I now lead the Medieval Studies Research Group. And we have just launched our brand new website for the research group this week. So if you enter it into Google, it comes up as one of the search items. And it looks absolutely gorgeous with that picture of Lincoln Cathedral, doesn't it? During my time at Canterbury, I was co-investigator on a major AHRC-funded project, and this was the Henry III Fine Rolls project led by Professor David Carpenter, which created a free online searchable English translation of the 56 Latin fine rolls of Henry III, which are all held in the National Archives and are one of the most important types of record for looking at Henry III's government. I then became involved in a second major AHRC project led by Professor Nicholas Vincent of the University of East Anglia, which made a very important contribution, which really helped to lead the national and international celebrations to mark the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta in 2015. During the last 7 years, through my role in developing schools resources on King John, Magna Carta and medieval women, through working with heritage organisations and museums, and through participating in community initiatives, including helping to set up the annual Canterbury Medieval Pageant and Family Trail, I've also tried very much to enhance the visibility of women's past lives beyond academia. The history of women in medieval Lincoln and Lincolnshire has also played an important part in my own academic journey, thanks to the rich and illuminating records that survive for women at different levels of society in this part of England. These records take the form of charters, letters, wills, financial accounts, court rolls, estate surveys, you name it. And so Lincolnshire women were indeed the subject of my doctoral thesis and later of my first monograph. And tonight, since I'm speaking during Women's History Month, I want to share with you some of my thoughts on what it meant to be an aristocratic woman in 13th century England. And I also want to offer you an overview of some of the avenues that my research has taken me down over the years. Now, over the years, my research has been very much informed by the ideological parameters by which women's lives were shaped and regulated, or supposed to be regulated, in the Middle Ages. 13th century England was a strongly patriarchal society, and at first glance it can seem as if this period was almost awash with negative gender stereotypes, which characterise women as fallible, as inferior to men. In Christian teaching, women were often portrayed as the true heiresses of the biblical figure Eve, who'd been created from the rib of the first man Adam, and whose actions had brought about the couple's expulsion from paradise, from the Garden of Eden. Consequently, women were depicted in religious literature as weak and irrational figures, as people who needed male guidance and governance. And many saints' lives were adorned with the moralizing tales of individual women whose behaviour echoed that of Eve at the fall, and whose actions actually served as warnings of the dangers that women posed to men's souls. This 13th century life of Hugh of Lincoln infamously recalled a story which can be traced in contemporary record of an elderly Lincolnshire knight, Sir Thomas of Saleby, whose wife was childless. To prevent the knight's honourable brother from succeeding to the family's estates as Sir Thomas's nearest heir, the wife acted with serpentine guile and wickedness to block his inheritance. She did this by attempting to pass off another person's child as her own. When the man whom the woman sought to defraud of his inheritance brought the case to Bishop Hugh of Lincoln's attention, the bishop summoned the woman's husband, who eventually admitted that the child couldn't be his. Bishop Hugh of Lincoln excommunicated those involved in the deception. The elderly knight died, and Satan seized Sir Thomas's soul for his role in conniving with his wife's wickedness. Let this be a lesson, wrote Bishop Hugh's biographer, Adam of Aynsham, to those men who are led into crime and sin by the weaker sex, which should be subject to them, and are not forewarned by the example of our first parent, whose wife, Eve, beguiled by the serpent, brought upon him and his descendants the awful fate of exile from paradise and death. A good Christian woman in the Middle Ages was a humble, obedient, attentive and faithful companion to her husband during marriage, and she went on to become a chaste and pious widow after his death. Written between 1247 and 1253, the St Albans monk Matthew Paris's life of Archbishop Edmund of Canterbury praised this archbishop's mother Mabel as just such a lady, playing upon the family's surname of Rich by describing how in marriage the Lord had so gladdened the Archbishop's father with his wife's undivided companionship and her fruitfulness in holy offspring, that he was fittingly and truthfully called Rich. After his death, the mother persisted in irreproachable widowhood, persevering in fasting, almsgiving and prayer, so that all the widows of Abingdon she was said to be a jewel. Isn't that nice? Now, women who went against the ideals of modesty, piety and respect for their husbands, on the other hand, could earn very harsh criticism, just like Thomas of Salisbury's errant wife. Women who were perceived as acting against Christian ideals were encouraged to mend their ways, and they received guidance on how to behave properly, especially from those churchmen who acted as their spiritual counsellors and confessors. The 13th century, after all, witnessed the arrival in England of the mendicant orders, the friars who quickly established communities across England and who became advisors to people at all levels of society. The Franciscan friar Adam Marsh, who was buried in Lincoln Cathedral after his death in 1258, was a frequent correspondent of Henry III's sister, Eleanor de Montfort, Countess of Leicester, in the late 1240s and early 1250s. Her letters that she received from him show that he was not afraid of calling this lady to account and urging her to modify her behaviour when he received concerning reports about her conduct. On more than one occasion, Marsh felt compelled to write to Eleanor so that he could remind her that it was a wife's duty to be bound to her husband by her strength and constancy, her prudence and her meekness and kindness. And somewhat tellingly, Marsh cautioned Eleanor in no uncertain terms that those whose minds do not fear to disturb the peace and love of their married life by demonic fits of anger are proved to be guilty of a violation of this duty. Therefore to such people is applicable that fearsome text, anger killeth the foolish, and envy slayeth the little one. So in doing so, Marsh actually gives us a valuable insight into Eleanor's tempestuous and at times turbulent relationship with her second husband, Simon de Montfort, the man who became the leader of a major baronial movement against Henry III. On another occasion, Marsh felt moved to write to Countess Eleanor again, expressing his disappointment, and blushes no less, at hearing an increasing number of unpleasant and vexatious reports of improprieties that were soiling her reputation. Marsh's censuring of Eleanor's conduct reminds us of the importance of the interplay of personality, privilege, status, and personal circumstance. And this meant that in life, ladies somewhat inevitably deviated from clerical ideals of conduct. And it's worth remembering that women's access to property and rights under the common law in this period were governed by a strict set of rules that limited their freedom of action. The author of the 13th century legal treatise, known as Bracton, famously described the relationship between the sexes thus: women differ from men in many respects, for their position is inferior to that of men. And among the English aristocracy, it was usual for young women to remain under the legal guardianship of their fathers or lords, who arranged their marriages. When young women married, they passed entirely into the control of their husbands. So on marriage in the eyes of the common law, a wife and all her property, that's her goods and her lands, passed into her husband's control, and she couldn't even draw up her last testament or will without his permission. If a woman was widowed, she could hold lands in her own right, but even then the king might force or persuade her to remarry a husband of his choosing, especially in the earlier part of the 13th century. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, inheritance practices also worked against women by relegating them to the position of second best heirs. When a lord died, his estates usually descended to his eldest son, and only when there were no sons could all the daughters in the same generation inherit an equal share of the family lands in England as co-heiresses. In widowhood, a woman was entitled to retain just a third of her husband's lands under common law as dower. That's her widow's share of her dead husband's estates, although local custom was sometimes a bit kinder and could sometimes allow her a half. In contrast, the custom known as the courtesy of England in this period actually allowed a husband whose wife had borne a living child, regardless of how long that child had lived, to retain his wife's property after her death for the term of his life. Women's rights were usually restricted in other areas too. They were excluded from knighthood and from the performance of many military and administrative functions associated with it in England. Unlike their fathers and brothers, young women of aristocratic status were not trained in armed combat and tended to receive a more limited education than their letters. The limitations placed on women's activity were recognised in literary texts that circulated among the aristocracy, where women were often depicted in domestic settings, learning and practising skills such as spinning and needlework. In one of my favourite works, Silence, a 13th century French romance, the eponymous heroine is raised in a fictional version of England where women are prohibited from succeeding to estates. To guarantee her succession to the family lands as an only child, her parents take drastic action. They deliberately disguise and raise Silence as a boy, and they train her to be a knight. In Silence's 12th year, the allegorical figure of nature appears to her and admonishes her thus. "It's a very nasty thing you're doing to me, leading this sort of life. You as a woman have no business going off into the forest, jousting, hunting, shooting off arrows. Desist from this. Go to a chamber and learn to sew." So what I hope this has shown is that the 13th century was potentially a challenging time in which to be a woman. Having said something about the frameworks which governed the lives of aristocratic ladies, though, I now want to move on to consider the ways in which we can create a far richer, more detailed and more nuanced picture of the roles open to women in the Middle Ages by reconstructing the lives of elite ladies through the records. In an era when the possession and successful exploitation of lands was an important basis for aristocratic wealth, female succession to estates held by military service was well established and often operated quite smoothly. 13th century Lincolnshire offers a good case in point. Between 1199 and 1307, 9 of the 13 baronies whose chief holdings were situated in the county descended to heiresses on at least one occasion. Of these 9, 4 descended in the female line twice, the baronies of Stainton le Vale, Brattleby, Bolingbroke and Freeston. The estates of 4 were then petitioned between multiple co-heiresses or their descendants. Although the heiresses to these lordships often married so that their lands passed into the control of their husbands, some women managed their inheritances as widows and fulfilled their obligations to the crown as tenants-in-chief by answering royal summons for military service through tenants or male representatives and by meeting the financial charges placed on their lands. A useful reminder of this is this rather nice little schedule of properties held by Nicola de la Haye, the holder of Brattleby, from the king on her death in 1230, which itemises the 16 knights' fees that she held in chief and which is stitched onto a fine roll for the reign of King Henry III. My research has often highlighted both the difficulties as well as the opportunities encountered by 13th century noblewomen in dealing with the crown, which sometimes threatened their wealth, property and welfare, not to mention that of their families, households and tenants. One Lincolnshire baroness at whom I've been looking very recently, thanks to the suggestion of Dr. Nicholas Bennett, is Petronilla de Crayon, the Lady of Freeston in Lincolnshire, and she's shown here on this family tree. Petronilla was a particularly long-lived widow. She probably married for the first time in around 1190. She inherited her father Geoffrey's barony in 1205, and by the time of her death in 1262, she outlived no fewer than 3 husbands. She wasn't, though, a terribly problematic woman, I don't think. Petronilla's career highlights as well the fluctuations in fortunes that individual ladies faced as landholders, and the vulnerability of heiresses in particular to the ambitions of senior royal officials and to the king's will, especially in the years before Magna Carta. So Petronilla de Crayon's first marriage was probably arranged in around about 1190 to William de Longchamp the Younger, a kinsman of the Bishop of Ely, Richard I's highly controversial chancellor. And here is this Bishop of Ely's seal. One of the complaints lodged against the bishop by a contemporary chronicler called Roger of Howden was the way in which this chancellor's nephews sought ardently to unite themselves in matrimony with earls, barons and magnates of the realm, in spite of this family's relatively lowly status, or birth anyway. Petronilla's marriage was one of those unions that was negotiated between the bishop and her father Guy, and we know this because the documents recording the settlement survive. These strongly convey Petronilla's own lack of involvement in negotiations, and also the efforts to which the Longchamp family went to gain Petronilla and her lands. The document recording the marriage agreement laid down that if William the Younger died, then his younger brother Henry would take his place as Petronilla's bridegroom. If Henry died, then a third brother would marry Petronilla. So 3 Longchamp boys were effectively set aside to secure Petronilla's hand. Now, although William de Longchamp the Younger inherited lands in Herefordshire, his acquisition through Petronilla of a valuable Lincolnshire barony, whose principal estates lay in Kesteven and Holland, increased his personal wealth. And Petronilla, for her part, was endowed in the second document by Bishop William, her new father-in-law, and William the Younger, with £30 worth of land in Herefordshire as her dower, should William the Younger predecease her. But by 1203-4, Petronilla found herself widowed. She soon remarried, and her new husband, Henry de la Marre, held estates in the south of England. The new match first comes to light in the curious entry on the Fine Rolls for 1205, which records how Henry de la Marre agreed to pay the king 500 marks to take possession of Petronilla's lands. And here's the entry in a 19th century edition of the rolls. This sum satisfied the king, and the local sheriffs were ordered to place Henry de la Marre and Petronilla in possession of Petronilla's property immediately. But what's really intriguing about this entry is that there is no reference to Henry offering money explicitly so that he might marry Petronilla in the first place. He simply paid a sum of money to take possession of her lands. So perhaps Petronilla and Henry had incurred John's disfavour by marrying without the king's consent, and this might help to explain the quite large fine imposed upon them, and roughly equivalent to around £333, to recover lands to which Petronilla was automatically entitled. Now, to make matters worse, Petronilla and her husband, Henry de la Marre, encountered difficulties claiming her dower from her first marriage. In 1207, a certain Henry de Longchamp, a kinsman of her first husband, offered the king 3 palfreys so that the royal justices would not hear a lawsuit that was then before them between Henry de Longchamp on the one hand and Henry de la Marre and Petronilla his wife concerning Petronilla's dower. Now, unfortunately for the couple, Henry de Longchamp's efforts to block the litigation were entirely successful. Since an entry on the royal court rolls for 1207, shown here in their Latin, records King John's order to the justices to stop this suit. So King John had listened to Henry de Longchamp's request, accepted the offer of 3 palfreys, and then stopped Petronilla and Henry de la Marre from suing Henry de Longchamp in a case that Henry de Longchamp otherwise stood to lose. Such was the prejudicial handling of royal justice sometimes under King John for members of the aristocracy. And as an aside, it's just worth noting that Petronella did not give up on trying to pursue her dower, and we can find her trying to recover her Longchamp dower in the royal courts as late as 1259 to 1260. Now, Petronella's marriage to Henry de la Mare proved to be relatively short-lived. By 1211, she'd been widowed yet again, poor woman, and she quickly remarried. Her new husband, who's shown on this family tree, was Oliver de Vaux, a man whose family held estates in Norfolk. This time, Petronilla had very little choice in the matter of her remarriage. An entry on the pipe roll for 1211, so a pipe roll is a type of royal account roll, noted a debt of 500 marks and 5 palfreys, which Oliver had incurred for having to wife Petronilla, who was the wife of Henry de la Mare and all the land of the same Petronilla. And one of the features of life under King John and the earlier Angevin kings was, of course, this trade in the marriages of elite widows. During the First Barons' War of 1215 to 17, then, Oliver and Petronilla remained loyal to King John and his son Henry III, even though several of Petronilla's knightly tenants joined the rebels. Oliver later went on to serve as a royal justice under Henry III and was still working for the crown in a local capacity as late as 1238. On Oliver's death, in or before 1242, Petronilla, his wife, finally assumed independent control of her lands, her inheritance in Lincolnshire and that much of her dower that she managed to secure, in her own right as a lord. When, in 1249, local jurors in Hampshire reported on Petronilla's situation, they described how she was in the king's gift and was marriageable once again. Luckily for Petronilla, though, Henry III's reign was a much safer time for aristocratic widows who wished to avoid forced remarriage than that of his father. The 1215 Magna Carta and its later reissues famously included clauses that offered protection for widows in securing access to their lands, their husband's death, and from the threat of forced remarriage. The continued currency of these ideals in royal circles is reflected by a rather nice entry that I came across on a royal memoranda roll for 1250, which recorded how on the 7th of October in this year, Henry III came with his council to the Exchequer and orders all his sheriffs who were gathered there, not only that they should observe and maintain the liberties of the church, but they should also similarly maintain all orphans and widows. Petronilla de Craon, our thrice-widowed Lincolnshire lady, retained possession of her barony up until her death in 1262, when it passed to her eldest son from her first marriage. So the 20 years then that Petronilla spent as a widow beg the question of how she managed the barony which she now held in her own name. And a valuable glimpse of the task performed by noblewomen as the heads of great estates is of course provided by a fascinating document produced for another Lincolnshire heiress, Margaret de Lacy, the Lady of Bolingbroke, whose life formed part of the focus for my first monograph. Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, put together a set of guidelines, an extract from which is shown on this slide, for running Margaret's estates and domestic establishment, which he dedicated to her as Countess of Lincoln, and which are now referred to as Grosseteste Rules. And Grosseteste Rules constitutes the earliest surviving treatise on estate and household management that's known to have been compiled for a member of the laity in England. And it's also one of my favourite texts. It's one I come back to time and time again. In being written for a woman, it gives us a fascinating view of contemporary perceptions of the respect that this countess inspired, regardless of her gender, of the authority that she enjoyed as a lord over her estates, over her servants, officials and neighbours, and it also gives us wonderful glimpses of the wide range of responsibilities that a female landholder was expected to assume in this period. Now this treatise, which was originally compiled in French, was adapted from Grosseteste's own Latin ordinances from his episcopal household. Robert Grosseteste's rules provide us with a vivid, if idealised, picture of estate and household management during Margaret's widowhood. And what also makes the rules so special is that it was based on an intimate knowledge of Margaret's preferred residences after the death of her second husband, Walter Marshall Jr., Earl of Pembroke, in 1205. In the past, the production of these rules was dated to 1240 to 42, which coincided with Margaret's first period of widowhood after the death of her first husband, John de Lacy. But the 12th rule, which advised the Countess of Lincoln on where she ought to make her purchases, mentions quite specifically estates that Margaret only acquired when she inherited her mother's barony of Bolingbroke in 1243, and when she took possession of her Marshall dower, that's her widow's share of Walter's estates, in 1245, and her widow's share of Walter's estates included the manor of Caversham, certainly initially at least. Now, Grosseteste's rules specified then that her wine, wax and wardrobe should be bought from Boston Fair when she was staying in Lindsay, Norfolk or the Vale of Belvoir. When at Caversham and Southampton, she should buy at Winchester, and when in Somerset, at Bristol. And we know from accounts held by the National Archives that the destinations of royal messengers that were sent to Margaret de Lacy as Countess of Lincoln in 1252-3 closely corresponded with the places where Grosseteste expected her to reside in this 12th rule, which was a really exciting find at the time when I was a doctoral student. It was one of those serendipitous moments, finding those accounts and matching them up with this rule. Now, the production of Grosseteste's rules was clearly intended to help the widowed Countess of Lincoln deal with the situation after 1245, when she enjoyed independent control of her mother's barony of Bolingbroke, centred on this lovely castle, and her own dower lands for the first time. The treatise was divided very sensibly into two user-friendly sections. The first concerned the daily management of an estate, and the second dealt with the good governance of the household itself. The rules in the first section offered Margaret de Lacy detailed guidelines on how she might be able to live on the produce of her lands throughout the year by setting out methods for estimating the total amount of corn grown each year, and then for calculating her household's consumption in bread and ale, two staples of the medieval diet. And Bishop Grosseteste clearly hoped that the Countess would live within her means. The rules specified that all the money collected on her estates from the sale of surplus corn and from the rents, the profits of local courts and the sale of livestock ought to provide her with sufficient funds to cover her expenditure on her kitchen, her wines, her clothes, her servants' wages, and improving the quality of the livestock raised on her estates. Grosseteste even went so far as to instruct Margaret to plan her household's itinerary for the coming year in advance at Michaelmas, taking into consideration the seasonal produce available at each manor for her sustenance. The role that the Bishop of Lincoln envisaged for Margaret de Lacy within the household was one that placed her firmly at the centre of its activities as a supervisor par excellence. Rule 14 admonished her to remind all the members of her household, great and small, that they should carry out her orders without any delay, obstruction or complaint. Grosseteste impressed upon Margaret the need for loyal, honest, obedient and hard-working servants, regulated by means of careful inquiries into the standards of their service. Servants who were disloyal, ignorant, vile, indecent, habitually drunk, and not useful were to be turned out of her household immediately. The Countess's position as the head of her household was to be recognised and upheld by her insistence that all her knights and gentlemen should wear her livery, her robes, and should not disgrace her with shabby and soiled attire. Texts like Grosseteste's rules are invaluable since they're revealing the ways in which the interplay of social status and wealth blurred gender roles and ensured that elite women occupied a central place within aristocratic families and structures of lordships. The routine responsibilities assumed by elite widows in medieval England, which we find reflected in Grosseteste rules, presumably often drew upon practical knowledge and expertise that they gained in marriage when they lived under the legal authority of their husbands. And for me, one of the most thought-provoking things that emerged from my early research into women in Lincolnshire was the evidence for the involvement of women in English local government in the Middle Ages. Here in Lincoln, at the castle and at the university, of course, the memory of Lady Nicola de la Haye is still something that is very much commemorated today. As the widowed heiress to the barony of Brattleby, as a woman whose family had long held a claim to the constableship of Lincoln Castle, Nicola really was an ideal figure to serve as this ruler's representative in Lincoln. And we can see the de la Haye's long-standing connectionship with the constableship of Lincoln Castle in these two charters. First in this charter, which was issued by King Henry II to Nicola de la Haye's father, Richard de la Haye, in the mid-12th century, and which confirmed him in possession of the constableship of Lincoln. And also in this charter, which hasn't quite survived as well through the centuries, and this is King Richard I's charter to Nicola's second husband Gerard de Canville and to Nicola herself, which confirmed then in possession of Nicola's inheritance in Lincolnshire with the keeping and the constableship of Lincoln Castle. Nicola's contribution to the Royalist war effort during the Civil War of 1215–17 as Constable of Lincoln and as one of England's earliest female sheriffs certainly left its mark on her contemporaries. When records of a government inquiry were compiled 60 years after these events, Lincoln jurors were still able to recall a meeting between King John and Nicola in 1216. During which Nicola had tried to offer John the keys to the castle and tender her resignation as castellan. Nicola explained that she was a woman of great age and had endured many labours and anxieties in the castle, and wasn't able to endure such burdens any longer. King John, for his part, had replied sweetly to these protestations, and he'd instructed Nicola to keep the castle. And keep the castle she most certainly did. No fewer than 28 royal letters, close and patent, were addressed to her between January 1216 and King John's death in October 1216. And what I find fascinating about Nicola's career is the fact that on the 18th of October, while John lay dying from dysentery at Newark Castle, he actually appointed Nicola Joint Sheriff of Lincolnshire alongside Philip Mark, one of his most notorious local officials. And the letter showing this appointment is on the slide here from a 19th century edition. Now, although Philip Mark disappeared from the records of Sheriff of Lincolnshire a little while after his appointment, Nicola retained that office until May 1217, when she ably led the defence of Lincoln Castle against the supporters of the French Prince Louis during the Battle of Lincoln, one of two great royalist victories that year that helped to draw the First Barons' War to a successful close for the royalists. And here is Nicola, looking rather splendid, if a little worn with time, on her seal, from a charter in the National Archives. Now, Nicola's played quite a strong role in establishing my own personal connection with Lincoln. In 2006, I actually delivered Lincoln Cathedral's Magna Carta lecture on Nicola in the glorious Wren Library. Her experiences as a government office holder also led me to explore the careers of other women who assumed roles as public officials in England during the Middle Ages, especially during my years on Henry III's Fine Rolls project and the Magna Carta project. Valuable routes into local government for women in this period were provided by the existence of hereditary or quasi-hereditary offices, which tended to pass from one generation to another within a family, but over which the Crown ultimately retained the overall right to confirm or veto appointments. Although women sheriffs were something of a rarity, female foresters, women who served as hereditary keepers of the royal forest and as foresters in fee, the sort of next level down, were a little more common, and the Forest of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, which became known as Sherwood, for instance, saw not one but two female foresters in the first half of the 13th century alone. And it's possible to point to other aristocratic ladies who served as castellans or who assisted their husbands and sons in this capacity. It was during the Second Barons' War of 1264-7 that King Henry III's sister Eleanor de Montfort, whom we met earlier in this talk as a correspondent of Adam Marsh, actually took up residence at Dover Castle, and she assisted Sir John de la Haye, the acting constable there during the summer of 1265, in safeguarding this fortress. Now, for those of you who don't know her well, Eleanor was the youngest daughter of King John, and she became one of the most important women in England during the period of baronial reform and rebellion. She was particularly important during the period between the Battle of Lewes in May 1264 and the Battle of Evesham in August 1265, when King Henry III became a cipher, a puppet king, in the custody of her husband, Earl Simon de Montfort. And for the last 15 years, much of my research has been focused on Eleanor's life and career, leading to a book-length biography of her and to another volume published last year, which was an edition and translation of her household roll for 1265. And this is a fascinating document. It's one of the earliest and most detailed private household accounts to survive from England, and it seems to have survived quite by chance because it accompanied Eleanor into exile in France when she surrendered Dover Castle in October 1265. It was probably actually preserved at the Dominican nunnery she entered in widowhood at Montargis. Its contents cover 13 membranes and run to 543 individual entries. They itemise the day-to-day expenses of the Countess's household on the front of the roll, so that's what's shown here in the middle of this slide. And these daily entries take the form of a diet account on the front of the roll, and they're a long series of entries that cover the period from the 19th of February 1265 to the 29th of August 1265, and they allow us to track where the Countess was, who was with her, so we know all about the visitors that she received, and the quantities of different foodstuffs consumed by her household at any one time. The diet account also tells us how these different foodstuffs were acquired, whether they came from existing stock, from purchase, from hunting, or from plunder. Further entries are found on the dorsal back of her household roll, which take the form of the wardrobe journal. These contain a whole host of miscellaneous business, and my favourites are the accounts that are listed for the expenses incurred by individual messengers who were sent to and from Eleanor, because these allow us to track all her different contacts at this time, her connections with her family, her connections with key Montfortian supporters. So what I hope my new edition translation of Eleanor's household roll has done is to really showcase her role as a political hostess, as a networker, as a linchpin of the Montfortian regime in the south and southeast of England. In the months immediately before and after her husband was killed at the Battle of Evesham in August, the contents of her roll clearly show us that Eleanor played a key part in coordinating the Montfortian war effort by paying for soldiers, at times for archers, and for the specialist services of men like Master William, the engineer. She also played a key role by liaising with the Montfortians who were besieging another castle at Pevensey. She also communicated with members of her family, with key Montfortian supporters, and she was just a tremendously important figure. And you'll be pleased to hear that one of her correspondents was Richard Gravesend, Bishop of Lincoln. Now, the roll's contents, when combined with information from contemporary letters and from the records of later inquisitions into rebels' lands, really give us a vivid impression of the collapse of the Montfortian regime during this year, and of Eleanor's efforts in particular, which seem to have been successful, reassuringly, to guarantee the safety of those members of her household who remained in England after she surrendered Dover Castle following a short siege in October 1265 to Henry III's son, the Lord Edward. So for me, Eleanor's life and career has really brought home the importance of aristocratic ladies as players on the national political stage at key points in the 13th century. For me, though, one of the most enjoyable things about working on the histories of medieval women, like Margaret de Lacy, Nicola de la Haye and Eleanor de Montfort, has been sharing my work with others beyond academia to promote a more rounded view of the past. So during my 3 years on the Magna Carta project, I helped to develop some of the women of Magna Carta biographies for the schools section of the Magna Carta Trust's Magna Carta 800 website. And this aimed to introduce individual women as political actors alongside the more famous male Magna Carta barons. One of the women who featured in these biographies was, of course, good old Nicola de la Haye. During my time on the Magna Carta project, I was also able to work with some lovely teachers, archivists, education officers, historical association staff and my former university's outreach team to produce national teaching resources for key stages 2 and 3 of the national curriculum, which were published on the Magna Carta project website. These were also published in print by my former university's outreach team, and they went out to more than 45 schools in Kent, and I think the final print run round to 2,000 copies, and they were received very well actually, which was really nice. When I worked on the Magna Carta project, I lived in Canterbury, and I also became an advisor to the museum exhibition on Canterbury in the Age of Magna Carta at the Beanie, which is the equivalent of the collection in Lincoln for people in Canterbury, and also on a Heritage Lottery funded touring exhibition called Magna Carta Rediscovered. And I had a thoroughly enjoyable time making sure that the stories of women were incorporated alongside the men. And one of the great joys as well of working on the Magna Carta project, as you may have gathered, were the professional collaborations and friendships that were forged in the build-up to 2015 and afterwards. So, through my work on the Canterbury Magna Carta Celebration Committee, I contributed to the Magna Carta Family Trail in June 2015, which stretched all the way around the city. And this led to those of us who lived in the city developing the Canterbury Medieval Pageant and Family Trail, which was led by the Canterbury Business Improvement District and Cressida William, the head of Canterbury Cathedral Archives and Library. And this medieval pageant and family tale takes place each year. It commemorates Henry II's penance for Sir Thomas Becket's murder, and has involved all sorts of people, community groups, reenactors, heritage organisations, the local parish churches, local school children, you name it. It won a Kent Tourism Award in 2017. And what's lovely is that between 2017 and 2019, it attracted more than 23,000 visitors into the city. And my role in the pageant has helped to ensure that the women are not forgotten. So in 2019, my last full year in Canterbury, I was very lucky because they actually decided that the key figure was going to be Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry II's wife. And so we had a wonderful actress playing the role of Eleanor, and we even had our own giant built of Eleanor. So we had a giant Eleanor of Aquitaine paraded through the city. It was really quite a sight to behold. And I think actually working on Canterbury's medieval pageant and family trail has been one of my most enjoyable experiences of working at Canterbury Christ Church University and of working at its Centre for Kent History and Heritage there with my colleagues Professor Jackie Eales, Dr. Sheila Sweetenborough and Dr. Diane Heath. And I think it serves as a useful reminder that medieval history and medieval women's history is something that can be enjoyed by absolutely everyone. So, since joining Lincoln in 2020, I've been returning to my research roots. I'm now a counsellor and trustee of the brilliant Lincoln Record Society, and I've been working with various people in Lincoln and Lancaster and at the National Archives to try and put together a new research project around these two gorgeous manuscripts, the Great Coucher Books of the Duchy of Lancaster. These are two deluxe illuminated manuscripts that contain more than 2,400 charters for the estates of the Duchy of Lancaster, and yes, in the Middle Ages, these did include the earldom of Lincoln. So I'm going to leave you now with these beautiful slides which show you the quality of some of the illustrations within these remarkable volumes. And we've just had some very good news about the funding for part of this project today, but I'm not quite able to share it properly yet. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed my talk and it's given you some insights into my life as a scholar of the 13th century and into life as a lady in 13th century England.
Thank you, Louise. I'm not so not so keen on that teaser at the end. I really want to know what that was now. We do have time for some questions, so if you would like to ask Louise anything, please do type it into the chat box and I'll read it out. But whilst you're warming up your typing fingers, I just wondered, Louise, could you say anything about how much we know about medieval women from their own writings as opposed to writings about them, and whether that differs for men?
That's a very good question, and that could be a very long one, so I'll keep it brief, the answer. Thank you, Stuart. It is one of the problems that we face as historians of medieval women. We don't have vast quantities of letters surviving. And that's why it's so important when we get documents like wills surviving, and also even household account rolls like Eleanor's, because they allow us to get much closer to women than we often can do. On the continent in particular, there's some lovely lives that survive of medieval women. There's a lovely life about Louis IX's sister, Isabella of France. And we actually sort of get some quite nice glimpses into her life about how she was able to write, how she was able to annotate things. The problem is, of course, that we don't hear her own voice directly. So it is a bit of a challenge. But I think really wills and household accounts for me have been the best way forward. And for one of my Countesses of Lincoln, we do actually have a letter that was sent in her name that was written in French, which seems to concern quite a private matter to a knight in Northamptonshire, which just simply asks for the return of a knife with a jasper handle that was lent by her husband because he now wants it to be sent on to him in France. So it is a tricky one.
Thank you, but they seem to offer you so much insight into these women. It's incredible what you can get from what you would think of as kind of quite dull documents, I guess.
They're not dull documents, Church. You must add tools to them that. That's terrible. They don't look the most glamorous of things all the time, but they are incredibly interesting once you get into them.
Fantastic. So, the thanks for the lecture are pouring in the chat. I haven't seen any questions yet, but hopefully we will get. Oh, there we go. Michael says, you said that Nicola de la Haye met with John and expressed her intention to no longer hold the castle. Were there unique challenges that the lady of the castle dealt with compared to her male peers?
I don't think there were particularly, other than the fact that the ladies of these castles were women. Very often they were served by male deputies, but what's really interesting is that it's very clear that the royal orders that are issued are addressed to them. And sometimes you actually find later examples of litigation where some of these female office holders get into hot water for rather dubious practices. So famously, Nicola de la Haye was awarded during the Civil War the lands of William of Huntingfield, who was one of Magna Carta's 25 rebel barons. And she clearly exploited his estates, asset stripped them, and he tried to sue her for the recovery of lost income in the region of, I think it was £273 or thereabouts after the Civil War. And he ended up just getting a rather modest out-of-court sort of settlement, which was quite amusing. So I think female office holders could actually be as good and as troublesome as male office holders in different parts of England.
Thanks. And that's kind of revealing in itself. I think that's fascinating. Well, there's a barrage of questions now. We have limited time, so I will try and get through them. Adam asks, what is the luckiest find you think you've had in terms of this period?
Oh, I don't know. That's a really hard question, actually. Oh dear, that's a really, really hard question. I really liked just finding the references to Margaret de Lacy in those accounts. That was incredibly exciting. Seeing that royal messages went to places where she was supposed to reside in sort of potentially a theoretical text, that was really good. That was one of my major highlights. But it's just so exciting when you're flicking through the folios of a cartload just even to come across a new charter by a woman. It's just, yeah.
Great. Maria asks, could you say something about the reasons for the greater protection of widows under Henry III? And do we know what lies behind this?
Oh, this is a very good question. I think they had been treated so badly under King John and his predecessors on occasion. There are examples of widows who, if they refused to marry under King Richard, for example, one of the king's nominees, they literally had their estates and their income taken away from them, and then that often understandably persuaded them to marry the king's nominee. I think they had been treated very badly in the past. If a widow was treated badly, it potentially affected the heir to her husband's lands and her other children. So I think the care of widows was actually very much a family matter in this period, and also a matter of concern for the widow's tenants. And I think there was a groundswell of opinion that just built up. And under King John, I think widows were exposed to sharp practices. And so I think this is why these clauses entered Magna Carta, and this is why they remained. As to why Henry III was a more sort of benevolent king towards the widows, Henry III actually was quite a benevolent king. He was quite kind towards the greater aristocrats of his realm. He didn't necessarily pursue them and hound them for their debts as his father had done. And so I think this protection of widows is all part and parcel of it. And the fact that there are clauses in Magna Carta that protect widows' rights, which then make it into the later reissues in Henry III's reign, show just how important it was to look after these older and important figures in society.
Thank you. So we do have an abundance of questions. So what I'm going to do, given the time, is read a few more out. And then anybody who has not had their question asked, if you would like to email that to lias@lincoln.ac.uk, we will endeavour to pass that on so that Louise can start that dialogue with you. That would be great. So Karenza asks, do you have any advice for students today who might be interested in pursuing research into medieval women?
Well, the wonderful thing about starting out researching this topic today is that since I began working on it in the early 1990s, actually so many more wonderful records have been published, they've been digitized, they've been made accessible in English translation. So actually there's a wealth of material out there. So if you want to start to work on medieval women, I suggest perhaps you might like to start with a queen or a princess whom you're particularly struck by, or just by looking and seeing what you can find out about women in your locality. Just finding who the local ladies were, who the local Brewsters were in the Middle Ages, that sort of thing. Read some popular histories and then get in to, the more academic stuff.
Great. What else have we got? Abigail, how has the field changed since you began your research? And are women now established as mainstream subjects of medieval history?
I think the field has changed dramatically since I started. It's lovely. We actually have a noblewomen network, which Charlotte Pickard and Harriet Kersey, who work on aristocratic women, helped me to set up, which involves people from Germany, from the US, from Australia. And what's lovely about this network is I don't think it could have existed to quite the same degree in the 1990s. And actually there is a far greater appetite now, I think, for looking at women as political actors, as people who lived as members of past societies quite fully. So I think the field is always at the moment rapidly expanding, and it's actually a very, very exciting time to work on gender history and women's studies. Yeah, the more the merrier is what I say.
Brilliant. So one last question, I think, given the time. This is perhaps more of an opportunity than a question from Helen. Are there any planned community projects in Lincoln, and do you have any upcoming key dates?
We don't have any upcoming key dates quite yet, but please watch this space and do keep an eye on the Medieval Studies Research Group website. But we are hoping to get things underway probably in about sort of 2022, 2023 on the community engagement side of things. And I have to say, in Lincolnshire, there's some wonderful groups who are working with volunteers. I've been out and given a talk virtually to the Spirit of Sutterby group, who are amazing, who are based near, who are very much interested in Bolingbroke. Branston has a University of the Third Age Medieval History group who are interested in women. So do just keep an eye out on the university websites, on our Twitter feeds as well, because we're going to start holding events before you know it.
Brilliant. So before I thank you for the last time, I just want to get in a quick advert for our next in the series. So hopefully you will join us on the 31st of March, where Professor John Sharp will be telling us about his journey in student enlightenment. So there's a slightly different start date of that one at 5 p.m. But hopefully you'll be able to join us there. So Louise, thank you so much for such a fantastic lecture. People have already been thanking you in the chat, but I'm sure that will carry on as everybody starts to peel away. But thank you so much, and have a great rest of your evenings.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you for those of my former colleagues who sent me 2 bouquets of flowers today. That was lovely.